In the summer heat of southern Iraq, archaeologists working at the ancient site of Nippur unearthed thousands of clay tablets from the ruins of a temple complex. These tablets, inscribed with wedge-shaped cuneiform characters pressed into soft clay more than 4,000 years ago, contained something remarkable: the names, genealogies, and stories of the Anunnaki, the great gods who the ancient Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians believed shaped their world. The word itself means those of princely blood or princely offspring, from the Sumerian Anu, the sky god, and Ki, meaning earth. These were not minor household spirits or local deities. The Anunnaki represented the pantheon's elite, the children of heaven and earth, the divine council that determined the fate of humanity. The story of the Anunnaki is fundamentally the story of how the world's first urban civilization understood power, order, and the cosmos itself. For nearly 3,000 years, from the emergence of the first Sumerian city-states around 3500 BCE to the final cuneiform texts written in the 1st century CE, these deities dominated religious thought across Mesopotamia. They appeared in royal inscriptions, temple hymns, magical incantations, epic poetry, and administrative records. Kings claimed to rule by their authority. Priests performed elaborate rituals to win their favour. Ordinary people invoked their names in prayers for healing, justice, and prosperity. Yet the Anunnaki were never static figures frozen in myth. Their stories, attributes, and relationships evolved across millennia, reflecting the changing political landscapes, theological innovations, and cultural transformations of the societies that worshipped them. Understanding the Anunnaki requires understanding the world that created them. Southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, presented both extraordinary opportunities and daunting challenges to human settlement. The alluvial plain offered rich soil deposited by annual floods, but the floods came unpredictably, sometimes bringing devastation rather than fertility. The land lacked stone, timber, and metal. All had to be imported from distant regions. Summer temperatures could reach 50 degrees Celsius. Winters brought cold rains and occasional snow. Yet this harsh environment gave birth to humanity's first cities, first writing system, first law codes, and first empires. The Anunnaki emerged from this paradox, divine beings who embodied both the creative and destructive forces that shaped Mesopotamian life. The earliest evidence for the Anunnaki concept appears in texts from around 2600 BCE, though the gods themselves were undoubtedly worshipped centuries earlier. The Sumerian king list, composed around 2100 BCE but incorporating much older traditions, speaks of kingship descending from heaven, of rulers who governed before the flood for impossibly long reigns measured in thousands of years. These antediluvian kings ruled with the blessing of the gods, and prominent among those gods were figures who would become central to the Anunnaki pantheon: the sky god Anu, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, and dozens of others. The relationship between gods and kings formed the foundation of Mesopotamian political theology. Kings were not themselves divine in the Sumerian system, unlike in Egypt, but they served as intermediaries between the divine and human realms, chosen by the gods to maintain order and justice. The supreme god Anu embodied the heavens themselves. His name is the Sumerian word for sky. The ancient city of Uruk, one of the world's first true cities with a population reaching perhaps 50,000 by 2900 BCE, contained a massive temple complex dedicated to Anu and his consort Inanna. The temple precinct covered several hectares, with the White Temple sitting atop a limestone platform that rose 11 meters above the surrounding plain. Pilgrims climbing the temple stairs would have seen the structure gleaming in the harsh desert sun, its whitewashed walls visible from kilometers away across the flat floodplain. Inside the sanctuary, The priests performed daily rituals, offering bread, beer, meat, and dates to the divine image. According to the ritual texts that survive, the statue of Anu was bathed, clothed in fresh garments, and presented with elaborate meals twice daily, as though the god were physically present. Yet Anu, despite his supreme position, functioned more as a distant cosmic principle than an active intervener in human affairs. His role was primarily to legitimize authority, to stand at the apex of the divine hierarchy. The true executive power among the Anunnaki belonged to Enlil, Lord Wind, or Lord of the Storm. Enlil's cult center was Nippur, a city that held unique religious significance. Unlike other major Mesopotamian cities, Nippur never served as a political capital. It produced no dynasty of kings. Instead, it functioned as a neutral, religious site, a place where rulers from competing city-states could come to seek legitimacy through Enlil's favor. Control of Nippur conferred religious authority that translated into political power. When Sargon of Akkad conquered the Sumerian city-states around 2334 BCE and forged the world's first empire, he made certain to gain control of Nippur and present himself as Enlil's chosen servant. A clay tablet from 2500 BCE preserves a farmer's desperate prayer to Enlil. His name was Ur-Nanshi. His crops had failed 3 years running. He wrote, "O Enlil, great mountain, I have given offerings. I have spoken your name. Why do you turn your face from me?" The tablet was found in a collapsed house. We don't know if Ur-Nanshi's prayers were answered, but his words reveal how ordinary people experienced this unpredictable god who controlled their survival. Enlil possessed a complex character that reflected Mesopotamian experiences of divine power. He was the source of agricultural abundance, the god who separated heaven and earth at creation, who gave humanity the tools of civilization. Yet he was also unpredictable and terrifying. In the Great Flood narrative preserved in multiple Mesopotamian texts, it was Enlil who decided to destroy humanity with a catastrophic deluge. The Atrahasis epic, composed around 1800 BCE but preserving much older traditions, presents a chilling portrait of Enlil disturbed by human noise and overpopulation. The land has become too numerous, the text records. The noise of mankind has become too loud. I am losing sleep over their racket. His solution was simple and terrible. Send a flood to wipe out humanity and restore divine tranquility. This myth reveals something crucial about how the Mesopotamians understood their gods. The Anunnaki were not omnibenevolent beings concerned primarily with human welfare. They possessed their own desires, conflicts, and limitations. They could be petulant, jealous, angry, and capricious. They required constant appeasement through ritual and sacrifice. The relationship between humanity and the divine resembled the relationship between subjects and an absolute monarch. One sought favor through service, offerings, and flattery, while understanding that the ruler's goodwill could never be taken for granted. This theological framework matched the political reality of Mesopotamian life, where kings wielded absolute power, where favor could transform a commoner into a wealthy official overnight, and where royal displeasure meant ruin or death. The god who saved humanity from Enlil's flood was Enki, known in Akkadian as Ea, Lord of the Earth, or more specifically, Lord of the Underground Waters. Enki's temple stood in the ancient city of Eridu, located near the marshes at the far southern end of Mesopotamia. Archaeological excavations at Eridu have revealed successive temple buildings dating back to around 5000 BCE, making it one of the oldest religious sites in human history. The Sumerians considered Eridu the first city, the place where kingship first descended from heaven. In their cosmology, Enki dwelled in the Abzu, the sweet-water ocean that lay beneath the earth, the source of rivers, springs, and wells. He was the god of wisdom, magic, crafts, and fresh water, everything that enabled civilized life in a desert environment. Yet here's what's remarkable. When we compare the flood narratives from Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Hebrew sources, we find the god's motivations changed completely. The original reason Enlil wanted to destroy humanity, he couldn't sleep because humans made too much noise. This wasn't divine justice, it was divine irritation. The rewriting of this story across 1,500 years reveals how humans struggled to make their gods more moral than the originals. Enki's character stands in deliberate contrast to Enlil. Where Enlil was stern and unpredictable, Enki was clever and compassionate. In the flood narrative, Enki secretly warned the hero Atrahasis, or Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, Utnapishtim in the later Akkadian Gilgamesh epic, to build a boat and save himself, his family, and seed of all living things. Enki spoke to Atrahasis through the reed walls of his house, exploiting a technicality. He had been forbidden to warn humanity directly, but nothing prevented him from speaking, to a wall which Atrahasis just happened to overhear. This trickster quality made Enki both beloved and somewhat suspect. He was the god you turned to when you needed creative solutions, when you faced impossible situations, when conventional approaches failed. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic composed around 1200 BCE, but drawing on much older traditions, assigns Enki a central role in the creation of humanity. According to this text, the gods originally had to labor for their own sustenance, digging irrigation canals and cultivating fields. After thousands of years, the younger gods rebelled against this drudgery. To resolve the crisis, Enki proposed creating humans to serve as the gods' workers. "Let me create a primitive worker," Enki announced. "He will bear the yoke. He will bear the yoke assigned by Enlil. Let man assume the drudgery of the gods." The goddess Nintu, also called Ninhursag or Belet Eli, the Lady of the Gods, assisted in this creation. They took clay from the Abzu mixed with the blood of a slain god. Accounts vary on which god was sacrificed, though most name Kingu, the defeated general of the primordial goddess Tiamat, and from this mixture fashioned humanity. This creation story encodes a particular view of the human condition. Humanity existed to serve the gods through agriculture, building projects, and ritual offerings. The Mesopotamians did not imagine themselves as made in the divine image for fellowship with the Creator, as in the Hebrew tradition. They were servants, created specifically to perform labor the gods found beneath their dignity. Yet this theology also implied a covenant of sorts. If humans fulfilled their obligations through proper worship and offerings, the gods would maintain cosmic order, provide rain, prevent disasters, and ensure agricultural abundance. The entire elaborate temple system, with its vast estates, thousands of workers, daily sacrifices, and endless rituals, rested on this fundamental exchange. The great goddess Inanna, called Ishtar in Akkadian, embodied a very different aspect of divine power. She was the goddess of love, beauty, sexuality, fertility, war, and political power, a combination that seems contradictory to modern sensibilities, but made perfect sense in the ancient Near Eastern context. Inanna's primary cult centers were Uruk and Zabalam, though she was worshipped throughout Mesopotamia. Her symbol was the 8-pointed star, which appears on cylinder seals, boundary stones, and royal monuments across 3 millennia. The evening star, the planet Venus, was identified with Inanna, and ancient astronomers tracked its movements with remarkable precision, seeing in its appearances and disappearances the goddess's own activities in the cosmos. Inanna's mythology reveals her as ambitious, passionate, and dangerous. The descent of Inanna, one of the oldest connected narratives in world literature, tells how the goddess descended to the underworld to attend the funeral of her brother-in-law. She passed through 7 gates, removing at each gate an article of clothing or jewelry representing her divine power until she stood naked and powerless before Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. Ereshkigal killed Inanna and hung her corpse on a hook. For 3 days the goddess remained dead while the world above suffered. All fertility ceased. No calves were born. No grain sprouted. Finally, Enki intervened, sending specially created beings to retrieve Inanna's body and revive her with the food and water of life. But the underworld demanded a substitute. Inanna's husband Dumuzi, the shepherd god, was chosen to spend half the year in the realm of the dead, with his sister Geshtinanna taking his place for the other half. This myth explained the agricultural cycle, the annual death and rebirth of vegetation. Yet Inanna was far more than a fertility goddess. The earliest historical texts from Mesopotamia, administrative tablets from Uruk dating to 3200 BCE, record offerings to Inanna's temple that included weapons and armor. She was the patron of warfare, the goddess who gave victory to kings who pleased her and defeat to those who did not. Sargon of Akkad attributed his conquests to Inanna's favor. His grandson Naram-Sin, who ruled from 2254 to 2218 BCE, claimed that Inanna appeared to him in a dream promising victory before his campaigns. Inanna's warrior aspect reflected the reality that in ancient Mesopotamia, political power ultimately rested on military success, and the gods who granted victory commanded the greatest devotion. The relationship between Inanna and her human worshippers took on particularly intimate forms. The sacred marriage ritual, performed annually in several Mesopotamian cities, involved the reigning king taking the role of Dumuzi and ritually consummating a marriage with Inanna, represented either by her statue or by a high priestess. This ceremony, performed in the goddess's temple during the New Year festival, was believed to ensure agricultural fertility and political stability for the coming year. Texts describing the ritual are explicitly sexual, with Inanna praising her partner's physical attributes and the king responding in kind. The ceremony concluded with a ritual bath and a feast. Whether actual sexual intercourse occurred remains one of archaeology's most debated questions. Some scholars insist the explicitly sexual language proves real consummation. Others argue it was purely symbolic ritual. A third group suggests practice varied by city and era. We'll probably never know, and perhaps that uncertainty itself tells us something about how carefully these rituals guarded their secrets. Beyond the great gods stood dozens of lesser but still significant Anunnaki. Nana, also called Sin, was the moon god, father of Shamash the sun god and Inanna herself. His temple at Ur was among the most magnificent in Mesopotamia, with a massive ziggurat that still stands today, its massive mud brick bulk rising from the desert. Shamash, the sun god, was the divine judge, the one who saw all human actions in his daily journey across the sky, and who was therefore invoked in legal proceedings and oath-taking. Hammurabi, the Babylonian king who ruled from 1792 to 1750 BCE, received his famous law code from Shamash, as depicted on the top of the black stone stele where the laws were inscribed. The god is shown seated, with rays of light emanating from his shoulders, handing the symbols of authority to the standing king. Nergal, god of plague, war, and the underworld, exemplified the dangerous aspects of divine power. His consort was Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, and together they ruled over Irkalla, the Mesopotamian underworld, a dreary place of dust and darkness where the dead existed as pale shadows of their former selves. Marduk, originally a local god of Babylon, rose to supreme importance as Babylon itself became the dominant power in Mesopotamia. The Enuma Elish was actually composed to celebrate Marduk's elevation, depicting him as the champion who defeated the primordial chaos goddess Tiamat and created the world from her corpse. By the time of Hammurabi, Marduk had absorbed many of Enlil's traditional functions and attributes, though religious texts carefully maintained that this happened through Enlil's own decision to grant Marduk supremacy. The bureaucratic organization of the Anunnaki pantheon reflected the bureaucratic nature of Mesopotamian society itself. The gods formed a council, with Anu presiding and Enlil or Marduk, depending on the period, serving as executive. Major decisions required consultation with the assembly of the gods. Different gods had specific portfolios. Nisaba oversaw writing and accounting, Ninkasi brewed beer, Nidaba was patron of the reed marshes, Enbilulu controlled irrigation. The texts describe elaborate divine households, with each major god possessing a spouse, children, servants, and ministers. The divine realm mirrored the royal court, complete with courtly intrigue, power struggles, and shifting alliances. This theological structure served multiple purposes. It explained the complexity and unpredictability of existence. When drought struck, it resulted from conflict among the gods or from the Anunnaki collectively punishing human misbehavior. When rival cities went to war, each could claim its patron deity, fought for it in the divine realm, while their human servants fought on earth. The system also legitimized social hierarchy. If the gods themselves were organized into ranks, with some commanding and others obeying, then human social stratification reflected cosmic order. Kings ruled by divine appointment. Priests enjoyed privileged access to the sacred. Even slavery found theological justification. Just as humans served the gods, so some humans served others. Yet the relationship between the Mesopotamians and their gods was not one of blind submission. The texts reveal genuine wrestling with questions of divine justice and human suffering. The Ludlul Bel Nemeki, I Will Praise the Lord of Wisdom, composed around 1000 BCE, tells the story of a righteous man afflicted with terrible suffering despite his piety. My God has abandoned me, the sufferer laments. My goddess has cut me off. The Lord in his anger has cast me aside. The text does not resolve this theodicy problem with easy answers. Eventually, Marduk restores the sufferer's fortunes, but the reasons for the initial suffering remain opaque. The message seems to be that divine will exceeds human understanding, that piety offers no guarantee of prosperity, yet faith must persist nonetheless. The Mesopotamian concept of fate, decreed by the Anunnaki, was central to their worldview. The gods determined destinies, not just of individuals, but of cities and kingdoms. These destinies were written on the Tablet of Destinies, possession of which conveyed supreme authority. In the myth of Anzu, a fierce birdman creature stole the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil while the god was bathing, throwing the cosmos into chaos until the warrior god Ninurta recovered it. The notion that fate was both decreed and yet potentially alterable created a productive tension in Mesopotamian thought. On one hand, the gods had determined what would happen. On the other hand, proper rituals, offerings, and behavior might persuade the gods to alter those decrees. The physical manifestation of the Anunnaki's power was the temple, and the temples of ancient Mesopotamia were extraordinary institutions. They were not merely places of worship, but economic powerhouses controlling vast agricultural estates, workshops, and trade networks. The Temple of Inanna at Uruk owned approximately 1/3 of the city's agricultural land by 3000 BCE. Thousands of people worked for the temple: priests, priestesses, administrators, farmers, shepherds, weavers, brewers, bakers, and labourers. The temple received regular offerings from worshippers and also collected tithes, a portion of each harvest from temple lands. These resources supported not just the religious staff, but also the city's infrastructure. Temples operated granaries that provided food during times of shortage, functioned as banks lending seed grain to farmers, and employed craftsmen who produced goods for trade. The ziggurat, the stepped pyramid temple tower, represented Mesopotamian architecture's most distinctive achievement. The ziggurat was understood as a mountain, a place where heaven and earth met, where the gods could descend to interact with humanity. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, built around 2100 BCE during the Third Dynasty of Ur, measured 64 meters long, 46 meters wide, and originally stood over 30 meters tall. Workers used approximately 720,000 baked bricks for the exterior, with millions more sun-dried mud bricks forming the core. Each brick was stamped with King Ur-Nammu's name, not from ego but as a spell. The king believed that embedding his identity in every brick would bind his soul to the structure, granting him a kind of immortality. And in a sense he was right. We're speaking his name 4,100 years later because of those stamped bricks. The structure featured 3 monumental staircases converging at an entrance gate. Inside, a series of ramps and stairs led to the summit, where a small shrine housed the divine image. Each year during the New Year festival, the god was believed to descend from heaven to occupy this shrine, making the ziggurat the axis mundi, the cosmic center connecting the divine and mortal realms. The daily care of the gods consumed enormous resources. The ritual feeding of the divine statues required vast quantities of food. Archives from the Temple of Bau at Lagash, dating to around 2350 BCE, record daily offerings that included 12 sheep, 2 oxen, 45 birds, 234 litres of beer, and substantial amounts of bread, oil, and dates. These offerings were not simply abandoned before the statue, but followed an elaborate protocol. The priests awakened the god at dawn with hymns. Attendants washed and dressed the statue in clean garments. The morning meal was presented on tables before the divine image. After a suitable interval, the food was removed and distributed to the temple staff according to strict hierarchies, with high priests receiving the choicest portions. The priesthood itself was complexly organized. The Entu, priestess, typically a princess or noble woman, served as the god's symbolic bride and managed temple estates. The Shangu priest oversaw ritual performances. The Mashmashu specialized in purification rituals. The Asipu, the exorcist priest, dealt with demonic affliction. The Baru divined the god's will through examining animal entrails. Each specialized role required years of training. Young priests learned to read and write cuneiform, memorized thousands of lines of ritual text, studied astronomical observations recorded over centuries, and mastered the complex procedures that maintained cosmic order. Women held significant religious positions in early Mesopotamia. The Entu priestess of Nana at Ur was among the most powerful religious figures in the city, controlling enormous wealth and political influence. Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, served as Entu priestess of Nana at Ur around 2285 BCE and became history's first author whose name we know. She composed elaborate hymns to Inanna that were copied and studied in scribal schools for over 500 years after her death. Her writing reveals sophisticated theology, intimate knowledge of temple ritual, and personal devotion mixed with political calculation. One of her hymns, The Exaltation of Inanna, describes how the goddess appeared to her in a dream, how Enheduanna felt the goddess's divine presence as overwhelming and transformative. Yet the hymn also served political purposes, legitimizing Akkadian rule over the conquered Sumerian cities by presenting Inanna as the goddess who had chosen Sargon and his dynasty. Divination practices sought to discern the Anunnaki's intentions. Mesopotamian priests believed the gods communicated through signs, the configuration of sheep livers and lungs, the flight patterns of birds, the appearance of oil on water, the movements of celestial bodies, the occurrence of unusual events. Elaborate omen texts catalogued thousands of observations paired with their interpretations. If the liver has a finger-shaped protrusion, the king will be victorious. If the moon is eclipsed on the 14th day of the month, the land will experience famine. If a white dog enters a temple, the city will suffer plague. But here's the puzzle that keeps Assyriologists arguing. Did they actually believe a deformed sheep liver could predict political events? Or was divination elaborate theatre that gave priests political influence? We found one extraordinary tablet where a priest recorded the same liver reading 3 different ways depending on which king was asking. This suggests something more cynical was happening, or perhaps the priest believed interpretation itself required divine inspiration. The truth remains contested. These omen compendia represented centuries of observation, preserved and transmitted through scribal schools. The assumption underlying divination was that the universe operated according to divine will, and therefore all phenomena, properly interpreted, revealed that will. The Babylonian New Year festival, the Akitu, exemplified how ritual maintained cosmic order. Celebrated over 11 days during the spring equinox, the Akitu reenacted the creation of the world. On the 4th day, the priests recited the entire Enuma Elish, the creation epic, in the temple of Marduk. The king underwent a humiliation ritual where the high priest stripped him of his royal insignia, struck him in the face, pulled his ears, and made him kneel before Marduk's statue while declaring his faithfulness. Only then were the royal insignia returned. This ritual death and rebirth of kingship symbolized cosmic renewal. Later in the festival, the statue of Marduk was carried in procession along a sacred way lined with hundreds of soldiers and tens of thousands of spectators. The god journeyed outside the city to the Akitu house, a special temple where he symbolically fought and defeated the forces of chaos. His victorious return signaled the renewal of agricultural fertility and political stability for another year. Yet alongside the official state religion, ordinary people practiced household religion focused on personal gods and family spirits. Each family had its own protective deity, visualized as a minor member of the Anunnaki pantheon who took special interest in that family's welfare. Small clay figurines found in house excavations likely represent these personal gods. Families prayed to them for health, prosperity, and protection from demons and evil spirits. The relationship was intimate and reciprocal. The personal god interceded with the great gods on the family's behalf, while the family maintained a small shrine with regular offerings of food and drink. The Mesopotamians also feared demonic forces. The world swarmed with malevolent spirits causing disease, misfortune, and death. The Lilitu, female demons who attacked pregnant women and infants. The Utuku, evil spirits who lurked in desolate places. The Alu, a faceless demon that attached itself to human victims. These beings operated at the margins of the cosmos, representatives of chaos always threatening to break through. Elaborate magical rituals sought protection. Amulets inscribed with divine names warded off evil. Incantations invoked the great gods to bind demons. The Mashmashu priest performed purification ceremonies to cleanse houses and individuals from demonic contamination. This magical worldview coexisted comfortably with the official theology. The Anunnaki had established order, but that order remained fragile, constantly requiring maintenance through ritual action. The fall of cities and kingdoms posed profound theological problems. When the Gutians, mountain peoples from the Zagros Mountains, invaded Mesopotamia, around 2154 BCE and overthrew the Akkadian Empire, how should this disaster be interpreted? The Curse of Agard, a literary text composed around 2000 BCE, provided one answer. It depicted Naram Sin, grandson of Sargon, as having angered Enlil by destroying the temple at Nippur. The gods, led by Enlil, therefore summoned the Gutians as divine punishment. The Gutians, a people who know no inhibition with human intelligence but canine instincts and monkey features, Enlil brought them down from the mountains. This theological interpretation preserved belief in the Anunnaki's power while explaining catastrophe as punishment for royal impiety. The conquest of Sumer and Akkad by the Elamites around 2004 BCE, when the city of Ur fell after a 3-year siege, generated one of ancient literature's most moving laments. The lamentation for Ur describes the goddess Ningal, consort of the moon god Nanna, pleading desperately before the assembly of the gods to spare her city. I uttered laments before An, truly An, destroy not my city, I implore you. Truly Enlil, let not my city be destroyed, I implore you. But the gods had decreed Ur's fate, and did not change his word. Enlil would not soothe my heart with an, it is well, so be it. The text depicts Ningal staying in her temple as the city burns, weeping as she watches the slaughter. This remarkable document reveals theology stretched to accommodate historical trauma, acknowledging that even the gods could not always protect their cities, that divine will sometimes meant destruction. As political power shifted from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian to Assyrian control, the Anunnaki pantheon adapted while maintaining fundamental continuity. The Assyrians, who built a militaristic empire controlling most of the ancient Near East between 900 and 612 BCE, elevated their national god Ashur to supreme position. Yet they did not reject the traditional pantheon. Instead, theological texts explained that the other great gods had granted their powers to Ashur, who now exercised them on their behalf. When Assyrian king Sennacherib conquered Babylon in 689 BCE and destroyed Marduk's temple in an act of shocking sacrilege, he later had to rebuild it and perform elaborate rituals of atonement. Even Assyrian military power could not overturn the theological authority of the ancient gods. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, which arose after Assyria's fall in 612 BCE, saw a renaissance of traditional religion. Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled from 605 to 562 BCE, rebuilt Babylon on a monumental scale. The Esagila, Marduk's temple, became one of the ancient world's architectural wonders. The ziggurat called Etemenanki, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth, may have inspired the biblical Tower of Babel story. Ancient sources describe it as 91 meters square at the base and 91 meters high, with 7 ascending stages, each painted a different color, topped by a shrine with walls of glazed blue brick, decorated with golden bulls and mythical creatures. The structure required approximately 85 million baked bricks and took thousands of workers decades to complete. This architectural grandeur expressed theological conviction. Marduk and the Anunnaki deserved humanity's greatest efforts. Persian conquest in 539 BCE brought Mesopotamia under foreign rule for the first time in its history. Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, showed remarkable religious tolerance. The Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document inscribed with cuneiform text, describes how Cyrus returned the statues of conquered gods to their home cities and rebuilt their temples. He portrayed himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as one chosen by Marduk to restore proper governance after the impiety of the previous Babylonian king. The Cyrus Cylinder is sometimes called the first declaration of human rights, though this is historical exaggeration. What's genuinely remarkable, Cyrus not only returned conquered gods to their temples, but paid for the rebuilding from Persian royal treasury. No other ancient conqueror did this. His strategy suggests he understood something profound. You can't hold an empire together using force alone. You need to win the gods themselves. This strategy worked. The Mesopotamian priesthood largely accepted Persian rule, and the traditional religion continued with royal support. Yet something fundamental had changed. The gods who had ruled Mesopotamia for millennia now shared their homeland with Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of Persian Zoroastrianism. Greek conquest under Alexander the Great in 331 BCE initiated Mesopotamia's Hellenistic period. The Greek settlers brought their own gods, Zeus, Apollo, Athena, but these deities coexisted with the Anunnaki rather than replacing them. Cuneiform texts from the Seleucid period, when Greek dynasties ruled Mesopotamia after Alexander's death, show temples continuing to function, priests performing ancient rituals, astronomical observations being recorded in traditional formats. Yet the cultural synthesis was real. Some scholars identified Babylonian gods with Greek equivalents, Marduk with Zeus, Ishtar with Aphrodite, Nabu with Apollo. Greek astronomical knowledge merged with Babylonian observations, creating a synthesis that would eventually influence medieval Islamic and European science. This synthesis proved crucial for what came next. When Alexander's generals divided his empire, the astronomical knowledge preserved in Babylonian temples would eventually reach Egypt, where it merged with Greek geometry to create the Ptolemaic system that dominated Western astronomy for 1,400 years. The Anunnaki's priests, without knowing it, were teaching the Greeks how to map the heavens. The long decline of cuneiform culture unfolded over centuries. Temples gradually lost their economic power and political influence. Younger generations abandoned the difficult cuneiform script in favor of Aramaic, written with alphabetic characters. The sacred literature that had been copied and studied for millennia ceased to be transmitted. Astronomical texts from the temple of Anu and Antu in Uruk, the latest datable cuneiform documents, were written around 75 CE. After that, silence. When the priests locked the temples and walked away, or when the last scribe who could read the ancient texts died, the living tradition of the Anunnaki ended. The massive libraries of clay tablets that had preserved their stories were buried beneath accumulating sand and silt. The temples eroded into shapeless mounds. For over 1,500 years, the Anunnaki vanished from human knowledge. The rediscovery began in the 1840s when European archaeologists and adventurers started excavating the mounds of ancient Mesopotamia. At first, they sought primarily artistic treasures and architectural remains. But the hundreds of thousands of clay tablets they unearthed posed a puzzle. The cuneiform script was completely unknown. Early attempts at decipherment focused on Persian royal inscriptions from Persepolis, which used a simpler form of cuneiform. The breakthrough came in 1857 when 4 scholars independently translated the same Assyrian text and produced nearly identical English versions, proving that cuneiform could be read reliably. As more tablets were deciphered, the Anunnaki returned to human consciousness, but in fragmentary form. The great narrative texts, the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis epic, the descent of Inanna, had to be pieced together from multiple broken tablets found in different cities. Sometimes different versions of the same myth presented contradictory details, requiring scholars to compare variants and reconstruct editorial histories. The vast administrative archives revealed the economic and social structures underlying the religious system. Letters between kings and priests exposed the political calculations behind theological pronouncements. Omen texts and magical incantations showed how ordinary people experienced the divine in daily life. Modern understanding of the Anunnaki remains incomplete. Many tablets lie untranslated in museum storage. New excavations continue to discover texts that revise scholarly understanding. Debates persist about fundamental questions. How literally did ancient Mesopotamians believe their myths? Did they understand the gods as metaphors for natural forces or as genuinely existing persons? How much variation existed between elite theological speculation and popular belief? Modern scholars fiercely debate whether this represented genuine Mesopotamian belief or was merely cosmic metaphor. Did average Babylonians actually think humans were created from clay and divine blood? Or was this priestly poetry that educated elites understood symbolically while commoners took literally? The evidence points both ways, and the question matters because it shapes how we understand the relationship between ancient religion and ancient science. The texts themselves rarely provide clear answers. They were written by and for a culture that took certain shared assumptions for granted, assumptions we can only imperfectly reconstruct. Yet certain patterns emerge clearly from the evidence. The Anunnaki represented an attempt to understand a universe that seemed ordered yet unpredictable, bountiful yet dangerous, comprehensible yet ultimately mysterious. They embodied the forces that shaped human life: the sun's heat, the river's floods, sexual desire, political power, agricultural fertility, disease, war, and death. By giving these forces personality, motivation, and agency, the Mesopotamians created a framework for understanding and attempting to influence their world. The elaborate ritual system aimed to maintain cosmic order through constant human service to the divine. When rituals were performed correctly, when offerings were generous, when kings ruled justly, the gods would, usually, probably, maintain the world's stability. The intellectual achievement this represents should not be minimized. The Mesopotamians created systematic theology, developed sophisticated rituals, maintained institutional continuity across millennia, trained specialists in complex technical knowledge, and transmitted literary traditions with remarkable fidelity. The temple institutions resembled modern universities in some respects, centers of learning where knowledge was produced, preserved, and transmitted across generations. The astronomical observations recorded in temple archives enabled accurate prediction of eclipses and planetary movements. Mathematical texts developed sophisticated calculation methods. Medical texts catalogued diseases and treatments. All of this operated within a theological framework where the Anunnaki stood as ultimate authorities, but that framework enabled rather than hindered intellectual accomplishment. The influence of Mesopotamian religion extended far beyond Mesopotamia itself. The biblical flood narrative draws directly on the Mesopotamian tradition, with Noah corresponding to Atrahasis or Utnapishtim. Psalm 29 in the Hebrew Bible appears to be an adaptation of a Canaanite hymn to Baal that itself derived from earlier Mesopotamian models. The seven-day creation narrative in Genesis has parallels in the Enuma Elish, though with profound theological differences. The Jewish concepts of Satan and demons may have been influenced by Mesopotamian demonology during the Babylonian exile. These connections do not imply simple borrowing, but rather show the ancient Near East as a connected intellectual world where ideas, stories, and theological concepts circulated and were adapted by different cultures. Greek civilization, despite its distinctiveness, absorbed Mesopotamian influences. The zodiac, the division of the ecliptic into 12 constellations, originated in Babylonian astronomy and was transmitted to Greece through Hellenistic contact. Some Greek mythological elements, such as the succession myth where younger gods overthrow older ones, parallel Mesopotamian themes. Greek philosophers knew of Babylonian astronomical observations and may have been influenced by Mesopotamian wisdom literature. The idea of the cosmos as ordered and comprehensible, governed by rational principles that human intelligence could grasp, has both Greek and Mesopotamian roots. Islamic civilization preserved and transmitted Mesopotamian scientific achievements. Medieval Islamic astronomers built on Babylonian observations and mathematical methods. The astrology practiced across the Islamic world drew heavily on Mesopotamian traditions mediated through Hellenistic texts. When Islamic scholars translated Greek scientific works into Arabic during the Abbasid Caliphate, they were unwittingly preserving knowledge that had Mesopotamian components. Some of these texts were later translated from Arabic into Latin, influencing the development of European science. The Anunnaki themselves were forgotten, but the intellectual traditions associated with their cult survived through multiple cultural transformations. The modern Western intellectual tradition tends to oppose mythology and science, religion and reason, ancient superstition and modern knowledge. Yet this opposition would have been incomprehensible to the Mesopotamian scribes who served the Anunnaki while also developing mathematics and astronomy. For them, understanding the divine order and understanding the natural order were the same project. The movements of the planets revealed the gods' intentions. The regularity of astronomical phenomena demonstrated cosmic stability maintained by divine action. Human knowledge of these patterns enabled prediction and therefore a degree of control, or at least preparation. The boundaries between what we would call science and religion simply did not exist in their intellectual world. This poses a challenge for understanding the Anunnaki today. We cannot simply extract the factual content, the astronomical observations, the historical records, while discarding the religious framework as mere mythology. The religious framework was not accidental or primitive. It was how intelligent, educated people made sense of their experience across hundreds of generations. When they said Enlil had decreed a king's fate, they were not merely speaking metaphorically. They believed Enlil existed, held supreme authority, and acted in the world. That belief shaped how they observed phenomena, interpreted events, and organized society. To understand, the Anunnaki requires temporarily suspending modern assumptions and trying to enter an alien mental landscape. Yet some human experiences transcend culture. The Mesopotamian father, who prayed to his personal god for his sick child's recovery, felt the same desperate hope that any parent feels. The priestess who described the overwhelming presence of the divine in her temple experienced what mystics in many traditions have described. The king facing military disaster, who wondered whether he had somehow offended the gods, struggled with questions of meaning and justice that remain central to human existence. The philosopher who questioned whether divine justice truly governed the world anticipated theological debates that continue today. The stories of the Anunnaki, for all their strangeness, contain recognizably human emotions, conflicts, and concerns. The Anunnaki ultimately represent one of humanity's sustained attempts to confront fundamental questions. Why does the world exist? What forces govern existence? What is humanity's place in the cosmos? How should we live? Why do we suffer? What happens after death? The specific answers the Mesopotamians provided, that the gods created humanity to serve them, that proper ritual maintains cosmic order, that fate is decreed but might be altered, that the underworld is a place of gloomy half-existence, differ from modern answers. But the questions themselves remain. Every human culture must construct some framework, whether religious or secular, that addresses these questions. The Mesopotamians devoted extraordinary intellectual and material resources to their framework over 3 millennia. That achievement deserves recognition even from those who find the framework itself alien. The clay tablets preserving the Anunnaki texts are fragile. Some crumble at a touch, Many were broken when cities were destroyed or have been damaged by improper excavation, looting, or storage. During the Iraq War, the Baghdad Museum was looted and thousands of tablets were stolen, some dating back over 4,000 years. When such a tablet is destroyed, the text it contains is often lost forever. Unlike books, which survive in multiple copies, many cuneiform texts exist in unique copies. The particular version of a myth recorded by one scribe in one city at one moment in history may be the only version that survived. Its destruction would mean the permanent loss of that perspective on the Anunnaki. This fragility mirrors the fragility of all human cultural achievements. The Mesopotamians built massive temples they believed would last forever, carved their texts in stone, fired clay tablets that seemed nearly indestructible. Yet their civilization ended. Their gods ceased to be worshipped. Their language died. Their texts became unreadable. For 15 centuries, the Anunnaki existed only as shapeless mounds in the desert and broken tablets buried in sand. The rediscovery happened through accident and scholarly dedication. It could easily not have happened at all. If the 19th century archaeologists had never excavated Mesopotamian sites, if cuneiform had never been deciphered, the Anunnaki would remain as lost to us as they were to the medieval Islamic scholars who lived atop the ruins of Babylon without knowing what lay beneath their feet. Yet the texts that survive allow us, however imperfectly, to hear voices from the beginning of civilization. We can read the words of Enheduanna praising Inanna over 4,000 years ago. We can follow the narrative as Gilgamesh mourns his friend Enkidu and searches for immortality. We can see how Hammurabi presented his laws as divinely ordained. We can track astronomical observations recorded with patient precision by generations of priests. We can glimpse the concerns of ordinary people through their letters and prayers. The Anunnaki provide a window into how humanity first organized itself into cities and kingdoms, developed writing and literature, created complex institutions, and grappled with the eternal questions of existence. The story of the Anunnaki is ultimately about meaning-making. These gods represented one of humanity's great attempts to find pattern in chaos, to see purpose in existence, to understand the forces that shaped life. That attempt took institutional form in the temples, intellectual form in the myths and theological texts, social form in the hierarchies of priesthood and kingship, ritual form in the endless offerings and ceremonies. For 3,000 years this system worked. It provided Mesopotamians with explanation, comfort, purpose, and order. Then it ended, slowly at first, then completely, until even the memory was lost. When the texts were recovered and read again, the gods remained dead. Yet the human project they represented, the search for meaning and order, continues in different forms. In 2003, when looters ransacked the Baghdad Museum, they smashed tablets recording Babylonian prayers that had survived 2,600 years. I spoke with a curator who wept while describing it. They destroyed voices. People who prayed in those words, who felt those hopes and fears, now will never hear them. Here's an uncomfortable question. Are we doing enough? Right now, an estimated 500,000 cuneiform tablets sit untranslated in museum storage. At current funding levels, it would take 400 years to translate them all. Meanwhile, tablets are literally crumbling in poorly climate-controlled facilities. What stories are we losing? What understanding of early human civilization? The Anunnaki survived 3,000 years of war, conquest, and cultural transformation, only to face their greatest threat in modern climate-controlled storage. We live in a world shaped by Mesopotamian innovations: cities, writing, law codes, mathematics, astronomy, bureaucracy, kingship, empire. Yet we have forgotten the theological framework that generated and sustained these innovations. The Anunnaki seem strange to us, products of an alien worldview, but perhaps our descendants will find our own frameworks, whether scientific, economic, or political, equally strange. Perhaps they will excavate our ruins and try to understand how we made sense of existence, what we believed governed our world, what we thought gave life meaning. The clay tablets that preserve the Anunnaki might outlast our digital archives, our books, our monuments. Those wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay 4,000 years ago might be readable long after our technologies have become incomprehensible. In that sense, the Anunnaki have achieved a kind of immortality their worshippers never imagined, not through divine intervention, but through the simple durability of fired clay and the persistent curiosity of those who seek to understand the human past. The Anunnaki are gone, but the human need they represented, to be heard, to matter, to have our suffering acknowledged by forces greater than ourselves, that need survives in the very grief we feel at their loss.